Hello! For today's video, I'm going to be doing my August reading wrap-up. I think I read 8 books total. I'm gonna count them. Yes, 8! So, I'm now going to talk about them. The first of those is The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi. He tends to write post-apocalyptic works or books that are like in the solid middle of that downward slope into the end of humanity in one way or another. And this one centers around access to water in the southwestern US. It's a look at various forces competing for water rights, and that competition is very deadly and very political and basically like an all-out war. A lot of this book I actually really liked, and I probably would have given this like 3.5, maybe even 4 stars, except for the fact that the things that I disliked about this book so greatly outweighed the positives that I ended up giving it, I think, 2 stars, which is a really low rating for me. I really only give out 1-star ratings to books that make me actually angry, and this I wasn't angry about, I just didn't like it. So, my issue. We had 3 point of views. I get that the politics of this book are so complicated that a lot of setup is just required to get a payoff in the end that I actually quite liked. But because a lot of the first half, even 2/3 of this book is setup, those 3 perspectives don't really overlap, they don't really interact, and so it can feel a little bit jarring jumping between them. The second half of the book, when they start interacting with each other, is significantly stronger, and the last third is by far the strongest part of this book, at least in my opinion. So I had some issues around perspective, but what really rubbed me the wrong way was the depiction of violence in this. I can read a violent book, no problem. My issue is that the violence seemed to be targeted primarily at marginalized communities. I think the intent there is to depict the fact that the systems that we have in place today, when confronted with scarcity of essential resources, the system is going to exploit those groups. Bacigalupi depicted that exploitation, but to me those depictions were like exploitative and sensationalized, and it was also like the vast majority of the violence that we're seeing on the page is against women, people of color, refugees, and there's one pretty graphic description of what's done, not like in the moment, but you hear about afterwards what had been done to a gay character, and so I was just like, oh, this is... Maybe I would have been more on the fence as to whether or not the depictions of violence were kind of sensationalized if it were not for the fact that there is a female character, a POV character, one of the main characters of this book, who is tortured. She is tortured in this book. And then a male character, he gets shot, which I understand, like, that is something that needs to be dealt with as well. But all of a sudden, the female character seems to forget the fact that she's like covered in wounds and bruises and like, what? It was just so blatant that the male character's wound was given much more weight and had greater implications and was of greater importance than the female character's wounds. And I was just like, what? Even this feels so just... It was transparent to a bizarre degree, and I don't think it was like an intentional thing. I just think it was lazy. There's a fair bit of research that, generally speaking, we don't take women's pain as seriously as men's pain. So I read that and I was like, okay, the things I might have been on the fence about, I'm not giving the benefit of the doubt. I did not like this. However, the next book that I have, I really liked. That is some nonfiction. I'm trying to read usually about 1 nonfiction book a month to just make sure that I'm reading widely, reading a bunch of different genres and not putting off nonfiction, which I have done in the past because it takes me longer to get through. So I'm trying to make an active choice to change that behavior and pick up more nonfiction. I'm rambling, but what I read was What the Eyes Don't See by Mona Hanna-Attisha. This is about the Flint water crisis. Hanna-Attisha is the pediatrician and research scientist who put the data together that proved that there was lead in the water and that it was leading to spiked lead levels in children in Flint, Michigan. It was just so good. I loved this. It does read more like a memoir, but considering who is writing it and just how brilliant she is and the breadth of her experience, you do get a lot of hard science nonfiction stuff in here, which I really appreciated. One aspect that I really liked is that she went into the politics of it, which I wasn't familiar with. Because Flint was a poor city, the governor of Michigan was able to appoint a manager to basically run the city, which means that the people of Flint were being represented by someone that they did not elect. And Hanna-Attisha looks at all of that in this book. The one thing that I wish there had been a little bit more information on, but I'm willing to forgive, because again, this does read more like a memoir about Hanna-Attisha's personal experiences, but I would have loved to have a little bit more about the activism that was going on in Flint, because we do know, and Hana Atisha does mention, that local residents and parents of Flint had been talking about issues with the water before Hana Atisha got involved, and so I would have loved a little bit more about that side of things. However, this is still such a good book. It feels like a very important read, and I definitely recommend it. Next, I read The Incendiaries by Ro Quan. This is some amazing literary fiction. It is, oh my goodness, so good. And it's pretty short, so it's like not a lot of pages, but packs such a punch. In this, we read primarily, almost exclusively, from the perspective of a guy named Will. His girlfriend gets wrapped up in a cult whose leader has ties to North Korea, and the cult then becomes involved in terrorist activity when they bomb an abortion clinic. It's Will trying to make sense of this, trying to make sense of the person that he loved, and also we get little tiny snippets from, maybe, it's unclear, the perspective of the cult leader himself. Those are really, really short though. What I loved about this is how intentional every word feels. I went to a book event with Russell from Ink and Paper Blog and Joss from Squibbles Reads, and we saw Quan speak about her book, which she's just so, so brilliant. And it was a really fun event also. She talked about how particular she is with words, and not just what they convey, but how they look on the page and how they sound when you read them out loud. All of that goes into every line of this book, and it's very, very clear, and it's some incredibly strong prose. The other thing that I really loved is that, as I said, this is primarily from Will's perspective, but we get a kind of variation of Phoebe's point of view. So we get Will trying to imagine what he thinks Phoebe is going through. And so sometimes that's very explicit in the text, that Will thought that she would say this, and sometimes it was just Phoebe said this. Based on the chapters and where you are in the book, sometimes you as a reader can kind of forget where that line is, which I think is brilliant, because a lot of this is an examination of the people that we construct in our minds versus who they actually are. And so Quan does that with her prose, and it's just so brilliant. I adored this, cannot recommend it enough. Next, I read another great book, and that is A Heart in a Body in the World by Deb Coletti. I picked this up at the recommendation of Madeline from Novel Inc. She adored this, and I trust Madeline, so then I picked it up and I loved it. This is young adult contemporary. In this, we follow a girl named Annabelle who's dealing with grief and PTSD after some traumatic event has occurred. We don't find out what that is until the very end of the book. I've seen some reviews of people being mad that you don't find out what happened to her earlier on in the book, and I personally think that opinion is dumb. I mean, I get it, but like, it's not that hard to look up online what happened to her, and that's not the point of the book. The other main theme of this is the ways in which women are objectified and viewed as objects to be owned or controlled by men. Again, we don't know the specifics for the majority of the book, but we know that something has happened, and the perpetrator of this nameless tragedy is someone that she calls the taker. It looks at Annabelle's guilt associated with that person. It is just so brilliant, and I feel like I can't articulate this off the cuff. Like, I need to write it out, which I don't usually do for my videos. So this book looks at the ways in which society often blames women or conditions women to blame themselves for the actions of men around them. We see a lot of this in the news and in media, where it's like, if only so-and-so had said yes when he asked her out or hadn't rejected him, he wouldn't have committed some act of violence. Even though there is clearly a perpetrator, that blame is put on women, and this book looks at that, and it also looks at the ways in which women are conditioned to do that to themselves, to think, why didn't I do this? Did I invite some kind of action? It is a painful examination of that, but incredibly powerful and honest and vulnerable, and I just adored it. Oh, it's so good. And the other thing that I think is brilliant is that the plot, the premise of this, is that in order to deal with this PTSD and this trauma, Annabelle has decided to run across the United States. It's this brilliant literary device because thematically, Coletti is examining the ways in which women are reduced to being an object, just being a body, and then having the plot be based around Annabelle like reclaiming her body for her own and seeing it as a tool and having both a healthy and unhealthy relationship with it over the course of the book. It's this reclamation of agency. This is an arc that I picked up at BEA. It's coming out on September 18th. Please pick it up because it is so good and it feels so important as well. Next, I have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I feel indifferent about this book. I get why people will like it. There were aspects that I really, really enjoyed. This primarily follows 3 different female characters. One of them is from a Jewish family. I really liked a lot of the historical elements there. In the past, it was illegal for you to like lend money to your brother. It was called usury. However, you could lend money to someone outside of your religion, and so that's how a lot of Jewish families and the Jewish community became involved in banking. And that's also the root of a lot of anti-Semitism, because people perceived that work as somehow less than the work of other people, and it was just othering. Like, the Christian majority was not able to do this, and the Jewish minority was. People got very mad about that and often erupted into violence. That's a very interesting part of history that I've never seen depicted in a fantasy book, which was really cool to see in here. As I said, a character in this is from a Jewish family, and she kind of takes over her father's mantle as the town's moneylender, and then we get some fairy stuff woven in. My issues with this: it's very slow at first, takes a while to get going. We don't really get the interaction between those main characters that I was looking for. I liked that they were all strong in different ways, that we got this interesting examination of different types of female strength, but I would have loved to see them interact a little bit more. From a character perspective, they were fairly independent from one another, but their plots overlapped. I would have preferred the inverse of that, where their characters are more connected, but the plots are a little bit less. So that's something. And then I also found the sheer number of perspectives in this to be annoying. I was thinking to myself of like why Novik was doing so many perspectives when there's clearly 3 main characters. And I think, and this is just a theory, that she was going for kind of like an oral tradition in which a folktale has been passed down by many people. And so she was kind of mimicking that and having many people tell this story. I just didn't think it worked. This is the second Novik book that I've read. I get why people like her. I just do not think her books are for me. Next, I read City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab. V.E. Schwab is for her adult work. Victoria Schwab is for her YA and middle grade work. This is middle grade, and it's a fun, quick read. It didn't blow me away, but I also don't have any huge complaints about it. Plot ticked along. I liked the relationship between the main character Cass and her best friend, who's the ghost. The premise of this is that Cass, after a near-death experience, has the ability to pull back the veil between our world and the world of the dead. And like, she's got a best friend who's a ghost, which is really fun and cute. And it's also a very interesting and complex relationship dynamic given her abilities. It's clear that this is the first book in a series. So far, my guess is that those are going to be fairly self-contained stories, but you know, the first Harry Potter book is also pretty self-contained, as is the second and the third. So that's not like some huge criticism. I'm just curious how we're going to start to get kind of an overarching storyline over the course of several books in the series, because as of right now, I have no idea. This felt quite self-contained. I think it's cute and light, and if you're looking for a spooky book come October, or a little earlier if you're feeling ready, because technically it is fall, I would recommend this. Next, I read The Wicked Deep by Shae Earnshaw, and this was another kind of spooky book. This is young adult fabulist. It's got some fantastical elements, but it doesn't feel like urban fantasy. It's set in a town of Sparrow, and 200 years ago, 3 sisters were drowned in the harbor for being witches. They were thought to be witches because all the town's men fell in love with them. And after their execution, every summer, the spirits of these girls return, inhabit the bodies of 3 local girls, and then they drown boys. We follow a local girl named Penny. A new boy rolls into town, and Penny is interested, but also doesn't want him to drown. And so it's a look at all that kind of stuff. And it's a lot darker than some of the fantastical leaning young adult stuff that I've read recently. So that was really interesting, but I just didn't connect with this a ton. And maybe that was my headspace when I was reading it, but I was just like, nah. Also, I figured out a plot thing pretty early on, and so I was kind of just waiting for that to be confirmed, as opposed to another thriller-ish type book where you have a theory and then it's super exciting to see if it's confirmed or not. I wasn't like super geared up waiting for that, because I was like, oh, this is what's going on. Maybe that took the kind of fun out of the reading experience for me, but overall, I think I gave this like 3 stars. It was fine. And lastly, I have a book that I'm including in my August wrap up, even though technically I finished it in September. I read the vast majority of it in August, and it was so good. It's a new favorite. I loved this book so very much, and that is The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Shae. I still don't know how to say his last name. God damn it. The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Shae. This is massive. It is those 600 and something pages of dense literary fiction, and this is technically the trade paperback, so it's like very smushed up in this, but I loved every single minute of it, even when it seemed to wander off a little bit. It follows primarily two characters, the titular Cavalier and Clay, who are cousins, I believe. They are working in comic books as an artist and a writer respectively during the golden age of comics in the 1930s and 40s, and obviously because of that time period we get some World War II stuff involved in that. I loved this. The biggest thing for me is that I find so much of literary fiction so bleak. It's honestly a bit exhausting to read it because it feels hopeless quite frequently. It often feels like the things examined in literary fiction are all of the awful questions of the world. Why do human beings hurt each other? Why do families fall apart? What are the implications of trauma on a family over generations? And a lot of times the answers to those questions aren't happy. This book poses a lot of those same questions, but it's framed around the idea of auto-liberation, which is this idea of freeing yourself from whatever shackles you may find in society. And that is looked at in several different ways through the lens of being a poor Jewish family, a refugee. Sam Clay, one of the main characters, had polio as a child, so having a physical disability. Also, it looks at the ways in which you cannot always free yourself from those chains. And that's a nuance that I think is really important because otherwise I would have probably rolled my eyes at a lot of this book because circumstance and privilege and things like that all affect a person's ability to free themselves from whatever shackles they are facing, be they physical or existential. So that was a nuance I really appreciated. I just think overall it has a fundamentally hopeful view, which for me in a work of literary fiction, especially one this long, was something that I found so refreshing and identified with quite a bit. And I just loved it so very much. Then you have the fact that on a very surface level, this book just has a lot of the things that I'm really interested in. It looks at comic books, and I really like comics. Also, it's historical fiction. If you've watched my videos before, you know I love history. So reading that was really cool. But what I really liked was the specific area of history that it's looking in, because not only do I like graphic novels and comic books just like today, but the area of history that I was always most interested in, or areas I should say, was cultural history and the history of mass media. And that's all in here, and it's really, really fun to read about, and it's clearly very meticulously researched. So much of this book is so good. It's now an all-time favorite, and I am so excited to reread this at some point. I also really want to try reading it on audiobook, because I feel like that would be really fun, even though it would be so many hours. I loved this. It's gonna stay on my shelves forever. So that's it for the books that I read in August, plus one that I technically read in September, but it's fine. Let me know what you guys read in August, if you read any of these, what you're planning on reading, anything at all, down in the comments. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe to see more of my face. You can find me on Twitter at PossiblyLit and on Instagram at PossiblyLiterate, and I will see you next time.